Hey everybody, welcome to our weekly debrief. This is our weekly deep breath when it comes to the news. And you know, Smarter News is all about quick, concise, nonpartisan information. But once a week, we just want to take a second to take a little bit deeper of a dive on some of the top stories that we've been watching. I wasn't actually positive that I was going to be able to do our weekly debrief because you might be able to tell a little bit of lingering laryngitis from a summer cold. I know when I say cold, all of you are thinking, is it COVID? It's not COVID. Don't believe it's COVID, but it certainly took the wind out of my sails a little bit. And as you know, it's illegal to cough anywhere. So I've tried to take it easy over the last couple of days. I was inside an office and started coughing. I felt really bad, but I think I'm hopeful. I'm on the road to recovery. And ironically, we're actually seeing quite a bit of this sort of summer cold in my area, which goes to show what we've been talking about over the last several weeks with medical professionals really from all over the country, that these respiratory viruses are kind of coming up at weird times. Obviously, there's always that concern about new COVID variants and what's taking place. So anyways, luckily for me, thank you very much. We're on the mend. But we're kind of move into a summer period here on Smarter News. I like to do our debriefs once a week. I'm hopeful I can continue that pace. We're going to take a little time off over the next couple weeks. I'm going to be traveling a bit with my kids. And so we'll be continuing our reporting on Smarter News. We have a bunch of really exciting interviews coming up that I can't wait to share with you. But things may look a little different. So this is going to be our first edition of our summer debrief, which is hopefully a little bit more casual and a little bit more abbreviated because I know you are busy. So let's get started. What I'm going to do this week is I thought we have a lot of different news, as we usually do. You have a sampler of a lot of different news items. But I thought as a way to sort of anchor us today, I wanted to take a look at data. We got a lot of new data this week on some of our biggest stories that we're looking at. And so I thought, let's use the data as our guide. I'll take 3 data points from 3 big stories that hopefully will equip you with something as you're discussing some of these stories, because quite a few of them I'm sure you are. And then we're also going to take 3 stories to think about in the week ahead. Not only the week ahead, but really in the weeks ahead. So we're going to use that lesson of 3. For Smarter News, I always think 3 as a guide. You know, there's the Holy Trinity. So can't be that wrong, right? If the Holy Trinity is the power of 3. So I think 3, always a guide is 3 things. 3 things. You can remember 3 things. If you give me 4, I may not be able to do it. If you give me 2, I probably need another one. So we go for the law of 3, and I think it works. So we're going to start off today. I'm going to start off with some of our tougher stories, and we're going to move to maybe what we could categorize as some better news when it comes to the economy, although it's a little bit mixed, which we'll talk about. But one of the first things I want to talk to you about this week has to do with this report coming from ALERRT on the Uvalde school shooting. As you know, the Uvalde school shooting is one of the worst school shootings in American history. ALERRT is the Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training at a Texas State University. We spoke with their executive director, Pete Blair, just after the shooting. ALERRT is the nation's leader when it comes to active shooting training. And they are the go-to for everyone in the country, FBI included, about active shooting incidents. So what happened is in the aftermath of the Uvalde school shooting, the Texas Department of Safety called an ALERRT and said, would you do an investigation of what actually transpired here? Obviously, there's been a lot of different reports. I also want to preface this that the investigation remains ongoing. So we're going to leave ourselves a little bit of room, but this is the first of likely a few reports coming from ALERRT on what actually happened on that day. And so the data point that I would like to just pull out of this report, the report is more than 20 pages. There's a lot of different detail. It's, by the way, available to the public through the ALERRT website, which is ALERRT.org. So you can download it yourself. You can look through it. And what it does is it gives us a timeline and a deeper dive on the law enforcement response. So this is strictly focused on that. There's obviously a lot of different sides to this story, but this is focusing specifically on the law enforcement response. And so the data point that I think is really worth pulling out here, as difficult as it is the number 0. And the reason why 0 is important is that what we learned from this report is law enforcement officers took precisely 0 shots at the school shooter during this entire incident until the very end when they breached the door and they killed the shooter. There's a few reasons why this is important. Now, we're not advocating, I'm not certainly advocating that officers should just blindly fire at a school shooter. But the reason why this is really important is because it's not just about a lack of engagement with the shooter. What we learned from this report is after the first few minutes of response to this event, law enforcement did not aggressively pursue the shooter, move towards the classroom in an aggressive way, try to distract the shooter in any way. And this is what ALERRT is saying is one of the big takeaways from their investigation. In a typical school shooting, and a typical active shooting event, as Pete Blair was describing to us, the number one priority when you're training officers is that they have to stop the killing, stop the dying. And that is prioritizing the shooter, going directly after the shooter, because the faster you can get to the shooter, the quicker that you can end the incident. One of the things that is proven by this report that echoes what Pete told us just a couple weeks ago is that the concentration of activity of this incident happened in just the first few minutes of the shooter going into the school. And the more than an hour that it took to actually engage the shooter and eventually kill them, there's a lot of questions about what was taking place and why it was taking so long. We heard in the past, for example, that the classroom door was locked. We found out that that is likely not the case, that it was never locked. In fact, the lock was probably broken. So we're learning more things about what actually transpired inside the school that day, even though it's so extremely difficult to learn. So one of the things that Pete mentioned to us, and this was a very difficult part of the interview, and if I can grab the sound for you, I will. I was asking him about what average citizens can do if we ever find ourselves in an active shooting situation. And he said,
what we find is that when civilians take effective actions to protect themselves, events tend to end up much better than when they didn't really take any action. And so initially when we had actions, we were telling kids to hide under desks and things like that people were doing. That doesn't do anything for an active shooter other than make you a stationary target to be murdered. So we teach avoid, deny, defend. So avoid the attacker if you can, get out, get away from there. If for some reason you can't, for example, there's gunfire in the hallway, and if you go in the hallway, you might be shot. Deny access to your location, close, lock the door, barricade it, get out of the sight line so they can't see you. And as a last resort, defend yourself. And it's interesting in talking to people about defending yourself, they'll oftentimes say, well, this is a person with a gun. How can I possibly defend myself? And the answer is you would never choose to be forced into that situation where you have to defend yourself. But if you find yourself in that situation, you shouldn't allow that person to try to murder you.
Don't let them kill you, which was a very difficult thing for me to hear. And I'm sure it was difficult for you to hear as well, because that's so shocking, just even thinking about that framework in mind. But why I'm mentioning that is because the report actually supports why it matters to go aggressively towards a shooter, because you can see that this is statistically consistent, that most of the shooting happened at the very beginning of this event. We don't really know how many lives could have been saved if there was a faster response to engage the shooter. It wasn't a lack of response to the school. Officers were on scene really, really fast. It wasn't a lack of numbers. There were almost a dozen officers within that hallway within a few minutes. It wasn't a lack of different agencies responding. There were a lot of agencies responding. It wasn't a lack of equipment. In fact, there was equipment on the scene, equipment that you might have heard about, like ballistic shields, that those were on the scene early in this event. They weren't waiting an hour for some of this. They were on the scene early. So there's a question about why. Why wasn't there more aggressive movement? And this is still something that's being explored. The reason why I also think this story is important is that we're getting very different pictures of law enforcement in America, aren't we? Depending on our stories. So for example, we have this report this week about the Uvalde school shooting, a devastating, horrific event where all of these little kids were killed. And there's a question being raised about why weren't officers more aggressive? Why weren't they engaging the shooter? On the other hand, in a different news cycle, well, actually, I could say it's the same news cycle, but in a different part of the country, there's a shooting, officer shooting of a young Black man, Jalen Walker, in Ohio. And the question in that particular case, without getting too much into the details here, is that there's a question about excessive police force here. Again, an investigation is ongoing. So you have these two images. You have different factors in both of these cases, but you have two different images of law enforcement. So how do you square them? One of the things that I did is I just wanted to look, well, how likely is it that police officers actually shoot their guns? for example. There's a case that was looked at specifically in Robb Elementary School in this report by ALERRT. One of the things that we learned in this is that an officer saw the gunman just outside the school before he goes in. And the officer had a rifle, and he asked for permission to take a shot because he can see someone with a gun right by the school. And the report suggests that either he didn't get a response that was timely or get a response at all. Either way, he didn't take the shot. Well, what's important to note is that according to this investigation, he was about 140 plus yards away from the shooter, which is a relatively long shot. Maybe not a shot that he had a lot of training for. Even though he had a rifle that could make that shot, how many times has he actually taken a shot like that of a suspect that's moving that you want to positively identify, and you want to make sure that your shot could be accurate, that it doesn't hit the school or any kids? And so there were considerations for why he didn't engage the shooter. And that's something I would say about this report, is that although it raises the question about why officers did not more aggressively go towards the shooter, move towards the shooter in the school, it's not attaching any number of attributions of saying that these were bad officers. They're raising questions of like, was there enough training? What sort of leadership was on scene? What other questions should we be asking to understand why that actually took place? So there's reasons for that about why an officer may not take a shot. And as I was looking through data, I was trying to figure out, well, how often do police officers shoot ever during their career? It turns out there's not actually great data to back that up. I found a Pew Research survey from a couple years ago that would suggest 1 out of 4 officers in their career ever shoots their weapon for any reason. But as I was doing some follow-up reporting on that, I found out that that data is probably not the best data to use. That even if you look at available data from major police departments, it could be more around like 3% of officers that ever could potentially take a shot in their entire career, which I don't know about you. Based on the news, I mean, we're covering the news on a regular basis. We cover shootings that are taking place that involve police officers. It seems like on a pretty regular pace. I would assume that maybe more officers would use their weapons during their career. Turns out, though, it's a very low percentage. So statistically, I'm confident based on my research that if you encounter an officer on the street, just, you're in the same coffee shop, the likelihood that that officer has ever used their weapon is statistically very low. And I think that's sort of an interesting data point to walk away with as we're looking at not only the Uvalde school shootings, but other shootings of a variety across the country that we're covering and will be covering certainly in recent weeks. So that's one of the big takeaways from this report by ALERRT. Again, that's available on our website. I also bullet pointed some of the other key takeaways from this report on smarternews.com, so you can look through it. If you don't want to read the full report, I created a kind of like a highlight card stack for you, because assessing what happened is also important for all of us, not only for our own personal response to an emergency. Again, statistically speaking, the fact that any of us could be involved in a shooting like this is very, very low. It's something to keep in mind for our next story, but it's still something that we're hearing about quite a lot. I know it's something that sits with a lot of you and may keep you up at night. And so I also want to mention that statistically, it's very low that we'd be involved with this. The assessment of these situations empowers us as citizens so we can ask the right questions for our own school security for our kids, but also for thinking about ourselves and our personal security. So that kind of leads us right into the shooting that happened at Highland Park on Independence Day. This community seemed like a very idyllic community, just north of Chicago, maybe like a 30-minute drive or so. And I'm just going to take a small portion of this rather big story. There's a lot to unpack here. But one of the things that really caught my attention was the data point about the shooter having previous run-ins with the law. So the data point that I want you to keep in mind is 14 days. And I'm going to come back to that data point in a second. So as we've been talking about shootings in America and gun laws, let's talk about a couple things. One, over the last several weeks, the president just signed into law a piece of legislation that was bipartisan in nature that's been described as the most significant gun law legislation in 3 decades. As part of this legislation, there was incentives kind of tucked into this legislation to incentivize the states to pass red flag laws. Red flag laws are something that we're going to talk about in just a second. But it's a way that law enforcement can respond to someone that is reportedly a threat, that has guns, and take those guns away, seize those guns. It's controversial. What you should know is 19 states, as well as the District of Columbia, have red flag laws in place, but not everywhere. And so you might say, well, okay, a red flag law seems pretty obvious, right? If someone is threatening to kill someone else, and they have guns, then they shouldn't have the guns, right? If we take the guns away, then they can't kill the person. But it's not quite as simple as that when you start unpacking some of the controversy around red flag laws and how different people think about it. So there's a spectrum, right? There's a spectrum of threats that people can make. And for example, if someone is threatening a very specific group of people, a very specific event, that could be looked at one way. If someone is having a heated argument and makes a threat, that could be looked at another way. And you may say, well, none of that really matters to me, Jenna, because if they're making threats and they have guns, I kind of don't want them to have the guns at all. Totally get that. But in America, we have something called due process. You're innocent until proven guilty. If you're a legal gun owner, you're a legal gun owner. And the government knocking on your door and seizing or confiscating your weapons goes back to the very beginning of the founding of America, where there's a visceral reaction amongst certain communities to that, even a probability of that, of saying someone somewhere could report me and then the cops are going to show up and take my guns. Wait, whoa. That's not America, right? I deserve due process. If someone has a threat, I should be taken in front of a jury of my peers, for example. So there are different ways of looking at these red flag laws. The reason why they've come up in this particular case is because police were responding to the shooter's household at the time for threats that he had made a couple years ago. And in that particular case, they had seized knives from this individual's home. And so in order for this individual to actually legally own a gun under the age of 21 in the state of Illinois, and I really want to stay focused on the state of Illinois because most of the information that we have, including that data point of 14 days, is very specific to the state. Red flag laws are different in the variety of different states that they're in. And if you see a red flag law being entertained in your state, it may look different than in other states. So I'm really focusing on the state of Illinois. In the state of Illinois, this individual, being under the age of 21, had to have a sponsor. His dad had to sign off on him buying a weapon. And there's some question about his dad saying he didn't know about these threats. We don't really know. Let's let that all sort out because we don't really know what's going on. I want to talk to you about these red flag laws, though, because they've come up repeatedly. A good way to understand red flag laws is as a restraining order. So just like a restraining order, there's a process. There's a process for a firearm restraining order, which is essentially what a red flag law is. So it can't just happen all of a sudden. You have to have somebody report to the police, I'm concerned for such and such a reason. Remember, depending on the state, you may have a series of things you have to do, or it may be rather easy to do it. Let's just say that there was a complaint made on a gun owner that they may be taking up arms, or they have plans of an attack, or they made some very serious specific threats. And the family member says to the police in a state where there's a flag law, like in the state of Illinois, I'm concerned, I don't want this person to have weapons. Well, a judge could issue this firearm restraining order, but the order is only good, and this is the data point, the order is only good for 14 days. For 14 days. So it's not indefinite amount of time. And sometimes when we're talking about red flag laws, it sort of seems like that. Oh, it's going to be so difficult for the person to get their weapons back. Well, 14 days in the state of Illinois. And then you have to go through a process if you would like that to continue. And it could continue for 6 months, but anything over 6 months is not very likely or very usual. It would be very difficult to do, to say to someone who's a legal gun owner that hasn't committed a crime, but has talked about a crime, to keep their weapons from them. You have no grounds to do it. What are your legal grounds to do it? There's no crime. This is a civil complaint. So check out this statistic. Illinois is a state of 12 million people. How many of these firearm restraining orders do you think are used every year? How often do you think this is used? Where someone's very concerned about a potential crime, makes the report, and the guns are taken. How many times? According to the Associated Press, in 2019, in the 12 million people in the state of Illinois, there were 34 firearm restraining orders. In 2020, there were 19. And the Associated Press is quoting a group that has done research into this process. So one of the questions that has come up, obviously, is if this person is a known entity, why were they able to buy a gun and commit this crime in Highland Park? Like, where was the breakdown? And apparently, the Highland Park police, according to the Associated Press, did share information with the state police about this particular individual. But it didn't go far enough. There weren't any specific crimes that he was guilty of. And there's only so much law enforcement can do if you have a clear background check that you're not guilty of any crimes. And especially as this individual then turns 21 and becomes, more of an adult in the eyes of the law, there's that other question about, well, was there anything to actually keep him from legally owning a gun? And what were the mechanisms in place if he was a legal gun owner to take those guns away from him? So this is going to be a really important part of this story to unpack, because clearly there was some sort of trail, but there wasn't enough to prevent him from legally owning guns in a state where the gun laws are strict compared to other states. So this is a topic to watch, but I was surprised to learn that, and I wanted to share that with you. 14 days. This red flag law in the state of Illinois, a judge could turn it around pretty quick if it's deemed to be a serious threat. But even if it's deemed to be a serious threat, the guns are only legally taken away for upwards of 2 weeks, and then you really have to go extra steps to get them taken away for 6 months. And after that, you're kind of in different territory. So I thought that was important news to know and some perspective that could be helpful as you continue to hear more about this story. Okay, final data point to know for this week has to do with the job market. I waited to do this debrief until Friday morning because I really wanted to see the jobs report, and we're going to be able to see now a picture of the first 6 months of 2022. What does the job market really look like? There's a reason why the job market really matters besides even jobs. So the data point I want you to know actually doesn't come from the jobs report. It comes from a separate report that came out this week. For every 2 job openings, or nearly every 2 job openings, there's one person. So you still have more job openings than you have people to fill those jobs. So we're still in a period of a labor shortage. We're still in a period where we're seeing a lot of people be hired. And in fact, the jobs report that we just got out shows better than expected job growth in the month of June. We're still seeing unemployment right around the mid 3% range, which is historically very low. And the reason why this matters is a fewfold. First, of course, we want to see the job market be healthy. That's important for the economy. And one of the reasons why some economists are wondering whether or not we could possibly be in a recession. Remember, a recession is a contraction of the economy. We got some data earlier this year that showed the U.S. economy could be shrinking. I'm sort of shrinking here as I'm talking to you. We don't want to see a shrinking economy. We want to see an expanding economy. So there's this question about whether or not America is actually in a recession. We wouldn't know we were in a recession officially until we have the data, and data is always backwards looking. So we could be in a recession. Some economists are like, well, we could be in a recession. We could see a contracting economy. But one of the things that keeps giving economists pause is like our job market is pretty strong. And that's not normally what you see in a recession. In a recession, you could see, high unemployment. I was looking back in 2008, 2009, during the financial crisis. I mean, we were seeing almost 9%, 10% unemployment. We're seeing in that range. So we're not anywhere close to that. And that's why there's a confusion of like, well, what's really happening with this economy? And yes, the job market looks healthy, but we still have this labor shortage. If we have a labor shortage, that slows down the economy. Where are all the workers? Why are we not fully back as far as employment? Why are there still several million jobs missing from before the pandemic? I would love to do more of a deep dive interview on this topic. I think this is really important, because I also think people are obviously working a lot different than they have in the past. And I'm curious about whether or not our data collection really reflects that. If you have a lot of people doing freelance or contracting work that they weren't doing before, they were actually on payrolls before, but now they're doing contracting work. Maybe does that flesh out a little bit different in the data? I'm not sure. So I think it's important to know that for every about 2, I say about because it's like 1.9, for about 2 job openings, you have one person looking for a job. And that's why you continue to see these help wanted signs. And you still see jobs being added to the economy, but there's still not enough. There's not enough jobs coming back and people to fill those jobs. And so we're at this kind of this weird part in the economy where people are wondering, well, what's actually happening to the U.S. economy? So that leads us to what to look for next week. Because next week, here are 3 data points that I think you should just be aware of. Number one, we're going to get a reading on inflation next week. That's going to be important. We're also going to get a reading on retail sales. This gives us an idea of consumer sentiment. These are like little data points that come up in different economic reports. You'll see these reports repeatedly come up throughout the week. And this gives us an idea of what's going on with the American consumer. At the end of the day, job market, anything else, it's like, how is the American consumer doing? You know, you're responsible for 2/3 of economic growth in the United States. The United States is the biggest economy in the entire world. You know, we're out there pumping the world economy. So how much pressure we're under and whether or not that's translating to us pulling back shopping, feeling a little bit more negative, economists are really going to watch that. And especially investors, you know, we've seen oil prices come down. And that's been a big story because here we had, you know, the national average for a gallon of gas was above $5, and that was a record. But we're seeing prices come down. We're seeing prices come down and oil prices come down, in part not for a great reason, but because there's concern about whether or not we're seeing the economy slow, not just here, but around the world. And so that's also going to be a big story to watch. But you got a bunch of data points about what's going on, like what's actually happening in the economy. There seems to be, you know, I love seeing these quotes from economists where they're like, well, I think that we're in a recession, but we may not be. You know, you're like, they're kind of, everyone's sort of like weighing, we're not quite sure what direction this is going. And I think that's actually important to know as we're in the mid-year of 2022. Okay, second thing that I think you should really be aware of has to do with what's happening in Ukraine. We haven't really talked about Ukraine. I've been watching these stories, and I'm growing more concerned about the different reports coming out of eastern Ukraine. We heard from the Institute of the Study of War that Russia was calling an operational pause on their pursuits in eastern Ukraine, but then on the ground, the data doesn't actually show that. In fact, CNN was reporting that 40 towns and villages have just come under attack in the last 24 hours, right around that operational pause. So the tension of what's happening in eastern Ukraine continues. Russia continues to make advancements. You're seeing a lot of questions about where does this go from here? You know, we've had a pace of covering this story that now, I don't want to say the world's lost attention on it, but it's become more a usual part of the news cycle than an abnormality in the news cycle. And so the question becomes, well, where does this go next? Russia continues to move. They're continuing to make advancements. Okay, it's not around the capital of Kyiv, fine. But if you look at a map, you're really seeing that Russia has been able to aggressively move over a large swath of eastern Ukraine. There's still a question about how you get any of that really important, those important commodity items like wheat out of Ukraine, out of Russia, because you have all this fighting in that particular part of the world. We know those food supplies are really important for particular parts of the world, like Africa, for example. So this war is continuing. We need to have it on our radar. Russia continues to make advancements. It's something to watch. And there has been a big meeting actually this week of foreign ministers in the G20. These are some of the, again, largest economies, most significant economies, countries in the world. They're actually meeting in Bali, of all places. All I can think about with Bali is that memoir, Eat, Pray, Love. So I don't know if they're having like an Eat, Pray, Love moment, maybe. I don't know if that could lead to some sort of diplomatic breakthrough, but the foreign ministers are meeting there. That includes Russia and the United States. So we'll see. It's just a story. I just want to make sure that we don't forget about it. And speaking of that, the other thing I want you to be aware of next week is the president is going to be going to the Middle East. It's always important to know where the president is heading. And the president is going to be visiting Israel, the West Bank, and Saudi Arabia. We know Saudi Arabia and Israel, they're major allies of ours in the Middle East. And this is going to be a trip that's going to last a couple days. It'll be important to watch the headlines that come out of this trip. You know, it could be regarding the oil market, for example. We could hear some news about Yemen. We haven't talked about that at all. The site of one of the worst, if not the worst, humanitarian crisis in the entire world. And that the United States and Saudi Arabia and Iran have all been involved in the past. We could be hearing about Iran. Remember, the United States continues to try to negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran. There's a question about that. So any number of big headlines can come from the president being in that part of the world. And I just think it's important to know that he's going to be on the road. And so you're going to see some headlines on that. So those are a couple things to be aware of. One of the best stories we covered this week, and I know we covered a lot of tough topics here, was a study out of Harvard University where researchers were looking at optimism and trying to measure how optimism affected longevity. There have been previous studies in the past that looked at smaller subsets of people. They wanted to see across demographics, across races, what does optimism do for your health? And what they found is that they believe, based on their research following, they looked at a broad swath of people across a more than 20-year time period, that people that had a more positive outlook added years to their lives. They were more likely to live longer and have longer lives, let's say above 90 years old, than those that did not. And what I loved about this, number one of the things that I loved about this is it suggested that optimism could add as much to your life as exercise. So if you're feeling like maybe you just need a break, you're just going to have to do like some real positive thinking. It's the same as going for a run. No, don't quote me on that. I don't think that's what they were saying, but they were trying to say, hey, listen, like if you're optimistic, we think that the data shows it's about equal to if you're really dedicated to exercise and how much exercise can actually add to your life. In both cases, it's about 4 years. So it's not a decade, but 4 years, we'll take it. But the thing I loved most about the researcher is she said that it's not, optimism isn't just blind positivity. It's not just not living in reality. It's actually about living in reality and then choosing to see obstacles and thinking that you can overcome these obstacles. I'm paraphrasing her here. And I thought that's such a great thing to think about. First of all, it makes me optimistic to think that optimism could actually be helpful to our health. So that's great research. But I also love that idea. I think sometimes we might think to ourselves, if I could just like avoid this negative news, if I could just not see it. I mean, we woke up this morning, for example, to the assassination of the former prime minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe. I mean, this is dark. It's very dark news. It's very upsetting. And all of these stories, even though there's a lot of different political perspectives to them, and you might find solace in the group that you agree with, they're still upsetting. There's still like a lot of upsetting stories. And there's a lot of unknown. We could look at that with the economy, for example. But I liked this research, and I liked what this researcher said, that the data shows this, that there's data to support it, but also that you don't have to be blindly optimistic about things. It's not about just being sunshiny all the time. It's about actually looking at the obstacles in front of you and thinking to yourself, I'm going to think positively that we're going to overcome that. And so I leave you with that thought because I think it's a good thought today, and we're going to end on an optimistic note. And we're going to just chalk up the extra minutes that we're going to add to our lives. So I'm so glad that we were able to spend this time together. Thank you so much as well for all your support of Smarter News. If you'd like to check out our shop, it is live and active again on our website. It's just shop at Smarter News, and you can check out a couple different items. If you're looking to do a little summer shopping, I'm hopeful to add a couple new items over the next several weeks. I'm really excited about that. And we'll be on the road. So I'll be on the road the next several weeks. I have big plans for Smarter News during this trip. And as you know, if any of you have kids, like we're just going to hope for the best. No, I really think we're going to be able to do some special projects for you over the next couple weeks. And we're, of course, going to keep up with all the different news items as they come up. So thank you so much for your support of Smarter News. I appreciate you, and you really keep us going and keep us optimistic about the state of news today. So I'm grateful for that, and look forward to your questions and comments. Welcome those all the time, and really appreciate your editorial guidance for us at Smarter News. So thank you. More on smarternews.com, and have a great day.